To introduce myself, my name's Jason Wordie. I wrote that. Starting off at the Casa Garden is a logical place to be. The building itself was used, as I'm sure many will be aware, by the East India Company. But when one thinks of the East India Company, one doesn't always think of architectural legacies one may not necessarily note. You see the shutters down, the green ones like this? These shutters are from Bengal. And the reason for that is that the trade links between Calcutta and Canton were back, forth, like that. Calcutta in the 19th century was the second city in the world. Calcutta is on the same latitude as we are here. So buildings then were built with the climate in mind. There was no air conditioning, there were no fans. So of course everything was designed in a climate like this to keep the building cool. And why was it designed to keep cool? Because if you were cool, you were healthy. And the green as well is Bengal green. We're going over to the church first and foremost. The building itself has some interesting architectural merit. As we look at this grey material on the front. Now we may today think, oh, it's a bit unattractive, but that's a material called Shanghai plaster. And this Shanghai plaster, this sort of aggregate made out of marble and granite chipping and concrete, was deployed as waterproofing. Because the buildings before, they were porous and they weren't terribly well built. So if you have this material put on them, it'll keep the water out from coming through and acts as a preservative. So when we look at this and we look at the cathedral and we look at some others, retaining that material today is actually of considerable importance because it's of its period. It also has very old bells. There's one bell up in the tower in there which dates from the 17th century. And Macau had an industry of founding bells and cannons and firearms for the export to Japan trade. From the early part of the 17th century up until the closure of Japan to the Portuguese in 1641, had an extensive element of church bells, cannons and other weaponry. The introduction of firearms into Japan was something which was done via Macau. But are there any questions here before we move on? I have one. Can people still hear my voice? Yes. Cool. Let's move. I'm not quite sure. I just paused here at the entrance to the East India Cemetery to mention a little about the gate above. An old cemetery, East India Company, 1814. Those who don't know any different might think, was that when the cemetery was established? It wasn't. That's the East India Company Charter. So that's the date for that. Now you may think he's walked straight in and pinched some flowers. Well, there was a reason for this. This is an important thing because what this is a lantern hibiscus. Now the thing with this is churches and schools, convents in this part of the world typically grew hedges of these things. The introduction of plants to many parts of the world was practical. So the 19th century, and that is the time when this came about, was the time of great botanical movements all over the world, plants going everywhere. And that transformed the world as we know it. Now the lantern hibiscus, why would it be grown in an institutional setting? That is because when you went into a convent or you went into a church or you went into school or something like that, you needed to be smart and tidy. People wore leather shoes. I wore these uncomfortable shoes this morning for a purpose because these ones, watch, do the same thing on here. Thank you. See? Polishes up your toe caps. Now that was the important thing because if you're going to a Catholic school, you'd end up in big trouble with one of the priests if you didn't have these tidy. They were grown specifically for that purpose. So someone coming into church, looking at, oh, that needs a bit of a buff up, shh, there we are. So it's a quick polish. And these things were also something of a lifesaver because during the Second World War, when there were over 100,000 Dutch civilian internees locked up by the Japanese, they used convents and schools and others as places where they could be put. These things are very high in vitamin C. So if you were locked up in prison camp and you didn't have much in the way of other nutrition, you'd be eating these. So these things had a useful purpose. So we'll go down this way. Having a Protestant cemetery in Macau is actually a curiosity, and it's an historical linkage to the changing pattern of trade. We start to see a rise of Northern Europe. So this is England, the Netherlands, the German states, the Baltic states, so the Swedes in particular. They had a very large East India Company. And by the early 18th century, there were more and more traders coming from Northern Europe, Protestants, and what happened to them if they died? Well, this was a challenge because the Portuguese had a fairly strict adherence to Catholicism. They didn't want heretics buried anywhere near them. Well, they were buried out beyond the city walls, up near Mongha, and there was a small cemetery there which was in existence from the early part of the 18th century until the early 19th, so it's about 100 years. The problem with this, though, is the Chinese villages in the area didn't want foreign devils buried around them either. So they'd quite often get dug up and chucked out, stuff like that. And this is where it leads into the establishment of this, because Dr. Robert Morrison, who was the one who translated the Bible from English into Chinese, he was here and he was engaged by various merchants as their official translator. But his wife was very popular among the foreign community, and when she died, they didn't have anywhere to bury her. So what was done is she was buried down in the corner of the garden. And very, very much in the Macau way, people look the other way. So, oh, we're not meant to be burying them in there, but oh, she's buried, and then someone else, and then someone else, and then someone else. And next thing you know, you've got a cemetery, and they go, oh. The cemetery, as I said, was really about 40 years use, high period of about 20. Then it was closed. You see the stones set into the wall along there. Now, all of those ones set in there don't actually have anyone buried in them or in front of them. They were from the original Protestant cemetery up at Mongha, which had been levelled out and flattened, and they were kept in storage by the Public Works Department. We're here under the shade of these frangipani trees. These ones are 150 years old. It was something which was actually brought to the China coast by the Portuguese from Southeast Asia. Frangipani. Now, the white sap that comes out of these was used in these parts of the world as a stunning agent for fish traps and bird traps and small animal traps because it's a bit toxic. So they're useful for that. But you want to grow it somewhere where children and other small animals that you might want to have don't eat it or don't touch it, because an adult will be fine with it, a little kid, it could be quite toxic to it. So you want to grow it somewhere where they're not going to touch it. So what will you do? Plant it in a cemetery. Now, the question was just put to me that you'll find on some of the gravestones the inscription saying died in the Macau roads. What the Macau roads were was a roadstead. Now, a roadstead is an anchorage. So the ships that were coming into this part of the delta by the early 19th century were actually too big to use the inner harbour. They had to anchor way out to sea. So the Macau roads, it's really the area beyond Taipa. So they had to anchor way, way out, which of course then made them very vulnerable to typhoon or any other climatic issue. Now, I've come in here, which is Andrew Longstead, is initially a Swedish East India Company trader who then went into private business. He chose to live here and retire here and die here. In his retirement, he wrote a very detailed history of Macau, and his history of Macau, which relied on very old sources. And the old sources that he used were many of those which got burnt over in the church. The conclusions that he formed were rather controversial. One of the foundational myths of Macau is that at the time of the Ming, the Portuguese were given this patch of land in return for dealing with some pirates. So the idea was it was a cession of territory. in that way. Lungstedt, going back at this point in time, said that that was false. If we go back to the time of Salazar, they went really out of their way to discredit Lungstedt. He didn't know what he was talking about, he was making up things, and he was against us anyway, and he was a Protestant, and he was yap, like so. It's, however, been in recent decades as the documentation have opened up, and yeah, actually that was right. And you see the inscription there says, erected by a mournful friend. Who was the mournful friend? We don't know. Now, we can't come into this cemetery without having at least a brief mention of Chinnery. George Chinnery is painted extensively in India and came on here because he was getting away from debt. Now, debt wasn't merely an embarrassment at that point in time, it was an imprisonable offence. What did he do? He buzzed off here and made a very successful life painting. And he was a very good portraitist, but he was also a very talented sketcher. In addition to escaping debt, he was also getting away from his wife, who he described as the ugliest woman he'd ever seen in the whole course of his life. So you think the misogyny is there, definitely. Macau, during the Pacific War years, was surrounded but not occupied by the Japanese. And there was an Anglican community in here which didn't have a vicar. And the Anglican bishop in Hong Kong, Ronald Hall, Ho Meng-Hua, a very, very interesting man. Obviously, with the war, getting in a European male would be impossible. They didn't have a suitable Chinese male. So he thought, okay, well, there's nothing against women, I think, in the book. So he ordained a Chinese lady called Florence Lee as the vicar for here. And she was the first female clergy in the Anglican Church, and she actually kept a license post-war. She ended up in China and had a not terribly nice life there until she subsequently left and ended up and died in Canada. We wouldn't necessarily think that with a little place like Hong Kong, it would have, like Macau, sorry, it would have this role in global gender change. We think that's the thing when we think of this here. There's a picture of her inside. Now, the thing with this lovely and peaceful and quiet spot is that we come in and we see the bust of the Portuguese national poet there in his cleft in the rocks, and historically the story that he wrote part of his poem in the cleft in the rocks, I mean it's a nice little tale, widely repeated. What is less widely noted in here though are the other bits of poetry dotted about. Over here. Sonnet to Macau from Dr. Bowring. Bowring ended up governor in Hong Kong, but he'd been with the East India Company here, with Bowring's poem, Garrett's there, other sonnets. Macau has inspired literature, poetry, right into the early times of here. And Macau as a source of muse and inspiration goes back over a very, very long period and across languages and across time periods and across cultural backgrounds. If you were to continue a little bit further up, the vantage point looking out, when we look out over the inner harbour, what would that have looked like 400 years ago? When one comes into this garden, you get the sense, which is so wonderful and palpable in Macau, that it is a very special part of China. This is China, but it's a very special part of it. And that's a thing I would conclude with. It's a thing worth bearing in mind, that it is very much of its place, but special and unique and distinct. Thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.